In this video, I'm going to go through explaining or giving you an example of doing REST and JSON inside of a Java Android application. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here as to exactly what's going on. This is just an example that we found on the internet. It's been tweaked a little bit, but for the most part, you can find some REST interface examples for Java that you can download and use for the Android platform. So right here is some of the code that was copied and pasted into this example. It's basically just a really short class. It has a post and a get process for submitting information to the control or to the class. And then just to take a look at the get function, just very quickly, it goes through and defines an HTTP client, gets everything formatted together for the URL, sends it off, and gets a response back, and then returns whatever that response is. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to take a look at a little application that we have here. So this is some code that we have in an Android application that's actually going out and getting some information from a REST server that we have. Now, the one thing to take a look at here is the actual code for the REST interface. So this is actually going out and building or sending a submit get, which is the function that we just saw on the previous page. It's sending a submit get, passing in the URL that we've defined in this particular code, and then it passes over our get parameters, which we are storing inside of this name value pairs. Now, once it comes back, we log the information to the log system, and then the next thing that I want to take a look at, so basically just to kind of define exactly what is going on right at this particular point, we have this Java application, this Android application, which is sitting here on our phone. It builds up a URL that it is going to communicate using the get process or the get procedure, and then it is communicating with our web server, whatever web server we have defined, and this is through a REST interface, which really isn't anything special. It's just a web page that's set to receive data or receive requests and pass back information, which is basically what all web pages do. The difference is that what this web page does is it actually goes out and defines our variables that it's going to reply back as a JSON object, which again is nothing more than a string with a bunch of parameter variables and their values in it. It then replies that back to our Android application, which is going to then parse the JSON string and work with it. Now, right now, this particular object that we have right here, this entire line right here is the part of this Android application sending the request to the web server. So right now, the only thing that we've done on this line is we have sent that request off to the web server. The web server then does its thing, packages it back up, and then replies back with that JSON string. And that JSON string is stored inside of this string value called contact. So when this thing comes back, it's going to have a string variable called contact that holds the entire JSON object that was built on the web server and replied back. So we already have the data that we were looking for right here in contact. The problem is that when we get contact, it only holds a string. It's got a bunch of variables in it and a bunch of their values, but we need to make it a little bit more intelligent. So the next thing that we're going to look at is, and this intent is really just a Java, an Android application that we're working with here. So what we're going to do is, let me clear the screen here. So what we're going to do is we are going to come down here to our control, and just to kind of show you a little bit about Eclipse, what I want to do is I want to come down here to this current contact activity. I'm going to hit the F3 key to actually go into that class because I want to actually see what it's doing. And then we're going to scroll down here and take a look at what's going on. So we can see here, if you remember, we stored our data inside of a variable called contact. And so here we're defining a new JSON array. So we've got a JSON object that we have over here. Once we define a JSON object that's going to hold the value of our array. So basically this JSON object is a variable. I mean, this is a type. It's going to hold, or its variable name is JObject. It's going to hold a new JSON array. So this is a function inside of the JSON array, and then we're passing it in our response from the server. So this is the same thing that we got from the server earlier. So this is our response from server. Now, what is going to happen here is we end up with this JObject that we're going to work with. So right now we're just looping through however many records are inside of that JObject. So the JObject actually knows that it's dealing with an array. So it has already parsed all of the individual string. As soon as we call this create function here, it has now parsed the string, and it has an internal array that it's working with. And so right here, we again, for each loop of the array, we define a JSON data. So this is an object that we're going to define here, and we're telling it to get JSON object at I. So this is the first element, so it'll give us the 0 element of the array, and then if there was 2 records in there, it'll give us the first element, then the second, and so forth, until it gives us all of the different contacts or whatever it happens to be inside of that particular JSON object when it gets through. Now, each of these lines are actually going out and calling that JSON data that we're defining here, and calling a .get string to get the actual field name. So these are all of these things that you see here are our variables that were passed back from the server. So these are variables from server. So our JSON object had a long string, and inside of that string it had, you know, things in there. Just as an example, it would say contact ID, colon, 123, semicolon, and then it had another field called business name, colon, whatever, ABC. So this is a lot like our post and get that we talked about earlier. It's a little bit different though. This actually is a JSON string. So this is something that the JSON object knows how to read and work with, but it's the same format. We're just basically defining what we want to separate the fields with, what we want in the fields, and then we let this JSON object go in and build our array and unbuild our array. So in other words, over on the web server itself, it received a HTML GET request. It parsed that into an array on itself. So it basically got the data, turned it into an array internally, and then it queried some database to get some data. It got a bunch of contact records. And then when it gets the contact records, it ends up with an array of information. So we have an array of info. It builds that. So builds array into a JSON object or a JSON string. And then it sends that string down to the in this case an Android app, which then does the reverse. It takes the string and turns it into an array, and then this is the code that we're looking at here that's actually going to use that array to do something useful inside of the application. Now, this is just a test. There's some, you know, obvious problems in here with the way that variables are declared and that kind of thing. But just as an example, this is kind of a rough draft as to how you would take data from here, send it off to a REST server. The REST server then builds up a JSON array, sends it back. We turn it into an array that we can work with inside of our Android application.